This panel is called Mobilizing the Private Sector for Sustainable Development. And I'm very pleased, before introducing our panelists, as the father of a daughter, as the son of a mother and a brother to two sisters, to announce that we are achieving SDG 5 in this panel. In fact, we're overachieving with respect to gender equality in this panel. I don't know if we're empowering all women and girls as is required by the SDG 5, but certainly we have achieved gender equality in this panel. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists and ask them to please come up and take their seats. First is Zoe Knight, who is the Managing Director and Global Head of HSBC Climate Change Center of Excellence. Next is Cherie Nursalim, who is the Vice Chairman of the GITI Group, followed by Vania Somavilla, who is the Executive Director, Human Resources, Health and Safety, Sustainability and Energy at Vale. And then lastly is Hans Vestberg, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Ericsson Group. And then I will move over and join the panel. So we are a little bit pressed for time. We're starting late, and we don't want to interrupt the next panel too much. So I'm going to give each one of our panelists about 4 minutes to give us a quick overview of how they view the role of the private sector for achieving sustainable development, and even more specifically, perhaps, the role that the private sector can play in the implementation and execution of the SDGs. But I also think it's important to start out by noting, of course, that the role that the private sector has is going to depend on the sector that the private sector is operating in. It's going to depend on the country. It's going to depend on the goals and the objectives. But clearly, one thing coming out of Addis Ababa was a recognition that we need to be moving beyond a notion of development as financed purely by ODA or purely by aid, and thinking much more broadly about the role of finance in sustainable development. And so I think with this panel, we really have a great opportunity to talk a little bit more specifically about how the private sector views their role. And also what we as all collectively as a global community or any institutions we happen to represent, what role we can play to help support the private sector in supporting sustainable development. So let me just proceed down this way, and Zoe, we'll start with you.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to share some views from the private sector on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. HSBC, as you all know, a global financial institution, has a key role in delivering those goals, not just for sustainable development, but also for climate finance more broadly. I represent the Global Climate Change Center of Excellence, which is clearly looking at mitigation and adaptation specifically and how to finance the transition to a low-carbon world. But what I want to share with you today is a few points about what the finance sector needs to achieve sustainable development, what the private sector is doing in terms of finance and how to tackle the funding gap that is in place at the moment, and also leave us on a note of optimism. So firstly, I'm sure some of you will have seen that the World Economic Forum estimates that $5 trillion of infrastructure funding is needed between now and 2020 on an annual basis. Now that's just for population growth and standard economic development. Now, in order to implement climate achievements and climate goals, actually that's $700 billion short. Now, some of that $700 billion funding will come from the public sector and the private sector, but we estimate that there's still a $300 billion a year gap of the funding requirement to enable a low carbon economy. And that's around the size of the Singapore economy. So the finance sector really has to step up to bridge that gap between what will be done for growth, but also what needs to be done for sustainability. The What the finance sector needs to achieve this is the right signals. Now, we've got some signals in terms of policy and regulatory drivers. Some of that will come out of COP21. Some of it comes from what countries are already doing on a national basis. But secondly, and I'm sure we'll pick up on this in a bit later on, is the economic incentive, the economic signals that will drive capital towards a low-carbon world. And that could come in the form of pricing carbon, or it could come at looking at subsidies for low-carbon alternatives. In terms of what other participants of the finance sector are doing, issuers, those that are raising capital, are providing transparency on how they're looking at sustainability and sustainable development. The growth of the green bond market, we think, is a good initiative to provide transparency around how capital is being used. And indeed, investors are providing signals by demanding these types of products and looking more closely and building coalitions around what needs to be done. Central banks are also looking at climate risk and resilience and sustainability, which is also helpful. So lastly, I'd like to highlight that whilst there is some uncertainty on what needs to be done among the financial community, the effort that is already in place shouldn't be underestimated. Investors have got a large degree of coalitions going on and are demanding more in terms of product for sustainable development. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Zoe. That's interesting, and I think the point that you make about incentives and market signals is critically important. But also, I think another challenge that we face is the fact that in so many of the markets that are in need of this kind of investment, the markets themselves are very underdeveloped. And in order for us to have the private sector play the role it potentially can in sustainable development, there's a clear need to develop these markets, develop instruments and systems in such a way that the private sector can function and play the role it might otherwise, it plays in the developed world and have it play a similar role in the developing world. Cherie, please, why don't you give us your perspectives?
Thank you. I would also like to thank Jeff and Guido for this opportunity. At the APEC in Bali over 1.5 years ago, you came and launched with the then Indonesian president and Lady Minister Mari Panelists, who is with us teaching now, visiting at Columbia University. The UN SDSN Southeast Asia and the SDSN Indonesia hubs, where I'm honored to be the chair of. SDSN is really a tremendous network, and at that time the forum was similar to this, but we call it the Trihita Karana International Conference of Sustainable Development. So many of you here would wonder, what on earth is Trihita Karana? It is not Hakutna Matata, but Tri, T-R-I, is the number 3. Hita, H-I-T-A, means happiness. Karana, K-A-R-A-N-A, is causes, or the 3 ways to happiness. So the Balinese, they live by this. So they believe in the 3 ways to happiness through, firstly, the harmony of people with other people. Secondly, is the harmony of people with nature. And last is the harmony of people with creation and the spiritual. So I look at the SDGs 1 to 17, and I actually kind of try to categorize. It really encompasses all these 3 aspects. So I think the UN has created the humanity's roadmap to happiness in the SDGs. So what what are we doing as a business? Well, talking about getting started, we have a development that is in Bali, in a prime location, 15 minutes from the mainland airport. It's called Kura Kura Bali Turtle Island. And so in this development, we have decided to develop it based on the three Hitakarana principles and dedicate it to support the SDGs. So I was fortunate yesterday at the breakfast meeting at the UN to have the opportunity to talk to the Secretary General that, at the core of this will be a campus and where we would promote the values of these three ways to happiness and applying the SDGs. My husband and I wrote a poem. I would just like to read it here. Three Hitakarana in search of happiness. She's harmony and balance, nature, peoples, creation. Behold, dark clouds swirled around her. Thunderous storms scour her. Invasion seeps from within. Unite in our diversity as love cradles her trembling heart. Warm breath nurtures her wounded soul. Full is the one who tries to capture her. She's the green of the fields, the rush of the wild ocean's waves. As precious and elusive as the rainbow rays, she smiles, embracing all earthly lights. Oh, submission is sweet. So let us submit to the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you, Cherie. And I think we've had some philosophy from you. We've had some poetry from you, but also something I think a great individual example about how business can contribute directly to achievement of sustainable development and directly to SDGs. Hans, from your perspectives, what do you think Ericsson or the business community can more broadly do?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me here to talk about the SDGs and the importance of this week and the historical things that's going to happen here. Think us a little bit back to the year 2000 when the Millennium Development Goals was sort of approved. Then the mobile world and the technology was not much deployed in the world. It was a couple of 100 million that had broadband connections and less than 1 billion people having a mobile phone. Where we stand today, that platform has transformed tremendously. It's over 7 billion mobile subscriptions in the world. It's a little bit north of 2 billion broadband subscriptions in the world. And it's a little bit more than 2 billion people having access to internet. And that technology revolution has gone fairly quick in 25 years. But the next 5 years, the technology revolution and the ICT platform is going to go extremely fast. So by 2020, it's going to be over 7 billion mobile broadband subscriptions. And just to get an understanding for what that means that more than double amount of people on this earth are going to have access to internet the next 5 years. And it took us 25 years to get where we are today. So the platforms of technology is rolling out so fast. Of course, mobility is in the heart of it. Over 90% of the Earth population will have mobile broadband coverage by 2020. So what we see is, of course, that this enabler, ICT, is enormously important in order to meet the goals, the SDGs that we're now putting up for 2030. And of course, what we're also seeing is that we think that the acceleration of reaching the goals has a very, very close connection to ICT and how governments, public, private are together developing it. And today, together with the Earth Institute and Columbia University and Ericsson, we're releasing our report that is ICT and SDGs, where we basically look into many of the 17 goals and how acceleration can be achieved by using ICT. I mean, everything from digital healthcare, digital education, using ICT for infrastructure, if it's smart cities or if it's smart grids, all of it will have an enormous impact on the acceleration of it. And this, of course, requires public-private partnerships, because historically, when we have built our ICT platform, we have had technology providers like Ericsson and operators rolling this out. If we're now going to achieve sort of these ICT platforms to be transformative and breakthroughs for many of the SDGs, we also need to work with the public sector. Everything from seeing that the technology is there to create healthcare platforms or education platforms, etc. In the report and the research we have done as well, we are giving many recommendations to governments from, of course, using ICT platforms for many of the public services there are, but also about training and education and content, because technology and ICT is just an enabler. We have to have a lot of content, education, training of these technologies. I mean, think just about financial inclusion. I mean, in 4 years, from 2011 to 2014, 700 million people on this earth has been included by getting mobile banking, which didn't exist 5 years ago. So we see that in sector after sector in the public area, that ICT will play a vital role. And our role from the ICT is, of course, to see that we highlight ICT and we see that these technologies roll out, and we're going to work with the public sector in order to achieve these goals in an accelerated form by using the ICT. And I think that's how we see our industry playing a vital role for the SDGs. And we have already done it from the Millennium Development Goals. What we see right now, we can do breakthrough changes by using ICT from 2015 to 2030.
Thank you, Hans. I think your point. I mean, all your points are well taken, but I think particularly this notion of how technology is enabling, but the content has to come, from somewhere. And oftentimes, we think about content with respect to innovation or with respect to entrepreneurs, but also there's content and partnerships that are important with government as well, and other stakeholders and other parts of society and community, and that it's just not the technology that's going to drive, it's that the content has to be there as well. One thing I'm remiss in mentioning is that we do have the hashtag ICSD 2015, and you can send me questions directly, which will show up on my iPad here if there are questions for the panelists, which I do hope we'll have a few minutes towards the end of this. But I would like to give next and last, but certainly not least, Vania, over to you for some of your thoughts.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers, and especially Jeffrey Sachs, that has been an inspiration for all of us. We've been working together with the Columbia Institute in the SDN Leadership Council for almost 3 years. So this week is very touching for all of us. It's really a historical moment, and we are going to remember this. And even the decisions that are taken here will be, the leader will conduct COP21 in Paris that will be decided mainly by the decisions that were taken here. So it's very important, I guess, that everybody can take the opportunity to celebrate being a part of this important week, maybe the most important week for the sustainability in the year and probably for many years to come. We believe that the role of business in the sustainable development has been increasing, mainly since Rio Plus 20, when it was everybody realizing there was awareness that nobody can do it alone by themselves. We need everybody in the same boat. So I guess that from the business side, working with World Business Council for Sustainable Development, probably you saw Peter Baker now in the morning, we decided that we should do our part. And we believe that if we do our part, we will lead even other partners. We don't expect to tell the truth. We don't expect governments to take leadership roles. It's not their profile. Politicians, they go after the innovations, they go after society. They are there just to make it happen, just to make it true, but they go after. This is the real truth. So we understand that we have a very important role. And I represent here Vale, that is a mining company, and mining always is covered with a lot of prejudice, but I can assure, and this is probably my personal view, my personal role in life, I have to prove that mining, when well managed, it can be a key enabler and also a catalyst for sustainable development, mainly in the regions, in the communities where we operate. So it's something that we are struggling, and we have to prove, we have really to do this. And we believe this is possible, and we have a lot of experience. It's not easy. I'll tell you briefly about a project that we are conducting now. It's a huge mining project in the Carajás region. It's in the Amazon forest. It's amazing because this project, it's in a huge protected area. This protected area only exists because of the partnership among business sector and the government. We help to protect this area that it's 400,000 hectares. Just to give you an example, it's 46 times the Manhattan area, this protected area. The mining project that takes only 3% of this area and helps, actually pays to protect it for the whole area. So it's a very interesting partnership, and also the technology that is key in this development. It's a very important part, and because in this project we use dry process, so we use 97% less water than in the original project, and we also have truckless that are conveyor belts that replace trucks, and we replace 100 trucks that used to be in old projects. Now it's a very, from the environmental side, it's a very sustainable project. But our main role was how to deal with the social side of these projects. This kind of projects, they lead to a lot of employment, but at the same time, there's a lot of migration and social and economic pressures on the communities. This was the most challenging issue that we had to face, and we decided to face it with the partnership and a good governance to deal with this. So we developed a methodology that we call PPSP, that is public-private social partnership. And we are doing with this, we are asked everybody to work together, because to tell the truth, at the very beginning of the project, the community, that is a small one, they expected the company to take the role of the government. So we said, no, we cannot do this, but we can put everybody in the same boat. And since we began in 2001, this community had about 10,000 people, inhabitants, and their GDP was 4.5 million US dollars. Now they have 30,000 people, and their GDP is 857. So it's spread a lot. It increased a lot. But the main role, the main question, how to assure that all these huge investments that mining and big projects bring to the cities, how can we assure that it will really bring sustainable and long-term development for the communities? That's our main challenge. We decided to use this methodology. We invited the local government, federal government, other business in the place, and even UNESCO to join us. And we believe that we are having a lot of success. We are still on a journey. It's a journey. Nobody can do it alone. But we believe that we can try together to build something more sustainable and bringing mainly what we need on SDG number 1. We want to finish the extreme poverty and put everybody towards the sustainable development.
Thank you, Vania, and again, I think that's a great example of the power that socially responsible, environmentally responsible investment can have in particularly natural resource sectors. And I think also your point that while often mining or natural resource oriented companies are sectors can get a bad name when it comes to sustainability. Of course, we see so many examples of where it's uncontrolled or where it's not undertaken in a responsible fashion, the negative side of it. So it's really very heartening to hear about Vale's experience and the work that you're doing. And of course, that's not unique. There are other companies that are doing that as well. But I think it's important that we remember that there's ways that this can be done in an environmentally, socially responsible fashion. So we are very, very short on time, but we do have a few questions from the Twitter sphere that I will put to our panelists. The first question is, we haven't heard really much about what the role of SMEs might be here. We have representatives from larger firms here, so anybody who might want to take a quick stab at what the role of SMEs might be in this. And then one other question we have is directly to you, Hans, is how to ensure that tech engineers actually know the complexities of a problem that technology can't solve. So anybody want to take a stab at the SME?
Yeah,
Please,
I'll go for the SMEs. So the SMEs are crucial because they're often doing things at a local level that maybe some of the global players that aren't at the top of the list of priorities for the global players. In fact, this morning I was at a session on corporates and adaptation, and it was a presentation of a prize, and the prize winner was a small corporate that had developed a technology to be able to process cassava on site instead of taking it away, which means that farmers were getting much more productivity from the cassava plant in Africa. And so those SMEs are crucial to driving change at the fast pace that we need to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and a lower carbon economy more broadly. So.
Thank you. Hans.
When it comes then to see that technology is well understood by the engineers, I think we need to first of all understand that on the mobile side, I mean, still the majority of the Earth population is having a feature phone, which is not a smartphone. Some of us sitting in this room take it for granted that we have a smartphone, but the majority of the Earth population is still on what we call the second generation mobile networks. That means that companies like ours that are spread in 180 countries, we work with app developers in order to let them simulate when they do different type of application. And that is not necessarily an application for entertainment. It can equally be for agriculture, financial inclusion, or what it can be. So we see that we have a role in order to work with them. And I would say in Silicon Valley, where we have the most of the app developers in the world, there we're opening up our technology in foundries. We are having our lab inside Facebook, for example. That's the way we are supporting to understand and simulate different technologies in different markets, because they're totally different conditions. And if you write an application that's going to work on a 4G network compared to a 3G network to a 2G network is very, very different. And that we can simulate, and that's a responsibility that we have as the largest mobile infrastructure vendor in the world, being in all these markets, to see to educate, because we have so far done a lot of development for people. For us, we are getting a lot of benefits of being connected. Now industries are coming in, and that's very important for the SDGs, everything from sensors and IoTs. And the next, of course, equally important, more important is our society. And we need to do application of society. And then we need to understand this environment. And I think that's how we try to work the whole industry, because finally, as the question on SMEs, there are many SMEs that's going to do these applications. It's not the large corporations.
Thank you. Vania, a question for you is Vale committed to creating a global standard of social responsibility for other mining companies? I think more broadly, what role do you see as Vale playing in the Global Compact or other such agreements?
We have some forums that we work together, mainly not only mining companies, but all the industrial sector as a whole. Mainly in the World Business Council for Sustainable Development is the global forum where we operate. Also ICMM is the International Council for Mining and Metals. We used to work with them. And there are many other forums. And we sometimes, when we operate in the same place, in the same country, we manage to work together. But in general, we work using the associations that we have.
Thank you. And one question, Cherie, to you is how can we move from corporate responsibility, this just general notion of corporate responsibility, more towards something that brings sustainable development into the core of what the companies do?
Before I respond to this, I think just on the SME side,
yes,
because I'm also on the board of the International Chambers of Commerce. They represent 6 million businesses and in 130 countries around the world. It's the sort of voice of business in the B20, G20. This year, Turkey is hosting, and SME is a very big part of the forum. And I think every year I host an event at Davos for the SDS and in partnership with university. I think Jeff was in the first forum that we hosted. So Alibaba, Jack Ma, I think the last one was the chairman of ICC, Terry McGraw, and Jack Ma came over and we had a discussion. And I think as you understand the phenomenon of this organization and many others that are happening I think from Dalian, I just came, the Premier Li Keqiang has this philosophy of 大众创业万众创新, which is mass entrepreneurship, mass innovation, and I think we are entering into a new era, and I think as what Hans has said about the world with the ICT, and sorry.
Sure. Well,
yeah.
what I'm going to do is that we're rapidly coming to a close. So what I'd like, I have one question from the audience that asks for specific, concrete examples of what each of your companies is doing to promote sustainable development. And so, really, as we're literally about 3 or 4 minutes away from closing, I'll ask each one of you to give me a specific, concrete example. And then we'll bring it to a close. And since you had your hand up, we'll go in reverse order, Vania, please.
It's related to the former question also, because I guess that the only way is when you put the sustainability in your decision-making process. This is the only way to embed it in the company. So we have, this is an example, we have developed what we call green internal rate of return in our company. A new project to be approved, it has not only to bring the economic rate of return, it has to bring also what we call green internal rate of return. So we set a lot of patterns, and the project is, if it's better than that pattern, it gains a plus, and if it's not, and so we have some figures for this, and this is part of the decision process. This is a way to assure that sustainability is embedded in the company.
Great. Hans.
In our case, we have been working for many, many years with both the Millennium Development Goals and attaching that to our technology. We have been doing, for example, Connect to Learn in many Millennium villages in Africa, together with the Earth Institute, rolling out technology, and then, of course, the Earth Institute and Columbia University coming with content in order to get better education in very rural villages. That way, and we have then many others, because we see that our technology has such a power. If it's healthcare workers in Africa have been enabled with a simple application just to get remote information, we have done that in many, many places. What we're doing right now as a company as such is also we have changed our charter for a wanted position. We are always measured financials, employees, and customers. And we are also including society and embedding the society strategy totally in our company, which is very much with the Sustainable Development Goals. And we will see that we are contributing to the 17 goals as a company as well, because we think that our technology has an impact and can accelerate all 17 goals. And we will follow up that as we're doing with financial goals, with customer goals, and with employee goals.
Thank you. Cherie.
So over 10 years ago, we set up a foundation called United in Diversity. I think we believe that the systemic issues that we face, no one sector alone can resolve it. And we invite the business sector, the government, and the civil society to collaborate. And we have a series of programs. We actually work with MIT, a leadership program where we have people from all these 3 sectors that over a period of time who are facilitated to solve specific issues, because ultimately I think what Jeff said this morning, the science and the heart, you know, and maybe combining with the hands, we have we have a program that allows these leaders to actually dig deeply into themselves and be passionate about the causes. And I think just now in my conversation with Joey, we were just saying, you know, that HSBC was joining this ICC pledge, and you know, she said it's great when you have a leadership that is supporting with passion. So I think it's all, I think it has to start with the leadership. And thank you.
Thank you. Zoe.
And so lastly, I think from our side, we've got it embedded both from the operational level in terms of how we run our business at every single location around the globe, and how we interact with our supply chain. So the operational sustainability is embedded through targets and metrics on reducing CO2 per employee, minimizing energy, minimizing paper, etc. So operationally it's embedded. And more so, I think, it's also embedded into how we deal with our client base. So a lot of the research we produce is educational and informative for how they manage their assets, and our own internal policies and frameworks of how we work with customers have sustainability principles embedded into them around risk assessment, etc. So it's embedded.
Thank you. Well, this has been a far too brief session, and really just, I think, barely scratched the surface on what I know our panelists would like to have put forward. And from scrolling through the questions we're getting on Twitter, I didn't come close to touching on nearly half or a third of the questions that came forward, and I apologize for that. We're rather squeezed for time, and there's another interesting session that follows immediate afterwards. But this has been, I think, a great session and has helped us really understand both what the role of the private sector is in achieving the SDGs, but also the responsibility that these representatives of the private sector feel that their companies have in helping execute and implement the SDGs. And we've heard both sort of from the spiritual and philosophical sense, but also more on issues around corporate scorecards and the ways that these companies are embedding this kind of work and this kind of perspective into the work that they do, and looking really more at a triple bottom line kind of approach, and moving far beyond sort of the caricature of corporate social responsibility. So with that, I'd really like to thank our panelists. I'd like to thank all of you for the questions, many of which I didn't get to touch on. But again, thank you all very much.